speaker today, Brother Pendergrass, and he will develop the theme, how do you fit into the kingdom or into kingdom arrangement? Brother Pendergrass, you have our attention.
Why do people care about government? You ever thought about that question? Why is it that every year people spend all this time and money writing books, airing TV shows, in fact, creating entire TV networks that do absolutely nothing other than talk about the government? What's the attraction here? Well, the answer is obvious. It's because it affects us. Just ask anyone who's unemployed, underemployed, someone who has a health problem, or even someone who simply has debt. Odds are every one of us falls into at least one of those categories. And so because it affects us, people want to understand government, the way it works, and how to improve their situation underneath that government. Now, we as Jehovah's Witnesses, we're affected by a lot of the same things that the rest of the world's affected by, and so we also have an interest in government. But when we talk about a government that's going to fix all the problems that we're dealing with, you'll find that we talk about a different kind of government than what you hear on TV every day. What we're referring to is God's government, or as the Bible calls it, God's kingdom. And the reason why we can say that this subject really is a unique topic of conversation among Jehovah's people, among the witnesses, is because there's simply no other group of people on the face of this earth that takes God's kingdom and the need to preach about it to other people as seriously as we do. Now, if you're here and you don't really know why we take that preaching work so seriously, then turn with me to Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, and we'll find the very clear answer. Matthew 24, verse 14. Here Jesus stated about the last days, our time, "And this good news of the kingdom will be preached in all the inhabited earth for a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." So if the end is going to come after the preaching work is accomplished, I would say that has an effect on us, wouldn't you? Of course. But you also notice there that someone has the responsibility to talk about that kingdom. Someone is supposed to preach that good news to others before the end comes. We'll get into that a little bit later. But for now, the odds are most of us here we're very familiar with that statement. We're very familiar with the need for the preaching work. And we're familiar with a lot more than that too. Most of us here would be able to, in just a couple of seconds, confirm that Jesus is King of God's kingdom, that he's going to be ruling over a paradise earth in the future with 144,000 co-rulers, and this paradise earth will take place after the War of Armageddon. A lot of us know that very clearly. But can you explain all that from the Bible? You see, only if we understand God's kingdom well enough to effectively explain it to someone else who's never heard those things, only then can we really understand how we personally fit into the kingdom arrangement, because explaining it to other people is part of how we fit into that kingdom arrangement. So if you're here today and you're not very familiar with the makeup of God's kingdom, then this is going to be beneficial for you. You'll learn a lot about what God's purposes are for this kingdom and what kind of changes it's going to enact in the future. But if you're here and you're already a dedicated minister of that kingdom, then we should also pay close attention and do some self-examination, find out how well can I actually explain what I believe from the Bible to someone else. After all, if we want to call ourselves Jehovah's Witnesses, we need to be able to witness to others about Jehovah from the Bible. So let's start off very simply. Let's establish who is the king of God's kingdom. And to narrow down that answer, let's figure out if it's going to be a heavenly king or if it's going to be a human that's in charge. Now, the Bible says that it cannot be a human king. It has to be a heavenly king. But can we prove that from the Bible? Absolutely. And we'll start doing that by looking at the principle in Jeremiah chapter 10 and verse 23. Jeremiah 10:23. Let's see what information we can pull from that and apply it to this question of who is going to be king of God's kingdom. Jeremiah 10:23. I well know, O Jehovah, that man's way does not belong to him. It does not belong to man who is walking, even to direct his step. What do we learn from that verse? Jehovah's principle there is that one man does not have the ability or even the right to organize his own life. So how could we possibly justify one person telling billions of people what to do? In fact, people have been trying to do just that very thing for thousands of years. How well has that worked out? By this time, we've gotten a lot of practice at doing it well, but we haven't gotten any good at it. Mankind has been trying to organize itself for thousands of years. It has not worked in the past. It's not working now. And there's simply no good reason to think that that's ever going to change in the future. The king of God's kingdom has to be heavenly. It can't be an imperfect human with imperfect judgment because of an imperfect heart. Well, besides that point, besides that principle, we also have what we also see is found in Psalm 89 and really throughout a lot of the Bible. In Psalm 89 and a lot of other scriptures, we see that Jehovah promised that the king of his kingdom, his theocratic king, would come from the line of King David of Israel. Well, that narrows it down even more. Now we just need to figure out who is of the line of King David and yet not human. Well, we probably know who that is. That's our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. The genealogies at Matthew chapter 1 and Luke chapter 3 show that Jesus really is of the legal line of descent of King David. And at Luke 24:51, it describes Jesus as being taken up to heaven. There's our criteria there. And Jesus himself sums up these facts in Revelation 22:16, where he says, I, Jesus, am the root and the offspring of David and the bright morning star. Where is Jesus when he's saying these words? He's in heaven. He's already been resurrected from earthly life. So it's very clear that Jesus is going to be king of God's kingdom. Now that we've established that, we have some other questions to answer. For example, when is this going to happen? Has it already happened? Well, to answer that question, and really to answer a lot of the questions that we're going to answer today, we have to delve into the background and compare Bible prophecy with actual history. And before we get into it, we have a little caveat. There's only so much that we can cover in the next 15, 20 minutes that we have left. There is far more than we could possibly try to answer fully in the time that we have left. So, again, as we mentioned at the beginning, regardless of your level of comfort with this topic, it's encouraged that all of us go home, do research, at the very least refresh our memories on this, on the way God's kingdom works. Or if you don't know much about it to begin with, obviously we're happy to help you answer some of those questions. For now, though, if you want to turn to Daniel chapter 7, that's where most of our comparisons are going to be made. While you turn there, what we're going to see in Daniel 7 is a dream that the prophet Daniel had. And in that dream, he saw several wild beasts, one after the other. Now, it's a vision, and as is going to be even more obvious, these are not literal things that are going to be happening. These beasts all represent something. And we can find out exactly what those beasts represent in Daniel chapter 7, verse 17. We're told, these huge beasts, 4 in number, are 4 kings who will stand up from the earth. All right, so there's our foundation. These 4 beasts that we're about to discuss and describe and that we're actually going to see on the screen here, they represent 4 governments, 4 kings. So, as for the 4 beasts, here they are. The very first beast, you can find in verse 4, it's a winged lion. This represents the speedy and powerful Babylonian Empire, which devoured nations and peoples, including God's nation of Israel, until it was destroyed by the second beast. The second beast, in verse 5, is a bear with 3 ribs in its mouth, and there's a voice that's said to be telling it to get up and eat much flesh. Well, this represents the huge, powerful Medo-Persian Empire, which grew far larger than the Babylonian Empire before it, and it conquered nations in 3 different directions, south, north, and west, which is the direction that it conquered the Babylonian Empire before it in. Now, the third beast, obviously, now conquered the second beast. The third beast is described in verse 6 as a leopard with 4 wings on its head, and 4 wings and 4 heads. This represents the speedy, powerful Greek Empire that began with Alexander the Great. Those 4 wings aptly depict how fast it conquered the entire Medo-Persian Empire before it, because Alexander the Great only did that in 7 years. 7 years, he eliminated everything that the Persian Empire did before it. And those 4 heads, this is a fascinating one to me. When Alexander the Great died, his empire was controlled by his 4 top generals, thus the 4 heads of leadership on top of a very speedy, powerful empire like that. Now, you can figure out what happened to this one. Now, the 4th beast conquered the 3rd beast, and that one is described in verse 7 as fearsome and terrifying and unusually strong. Unlike the others, it's not described as an animal that we're familiar with. This is unlike anything that we've ever seen. And that's what's described here. It's different from the other beasts, partly because it has 10 horns on its head, as you can see there. We'll talk about those horns in a minute. But this beast represented the enormous, powerful, for a certain amount of time, unstoppable Roman Empire, which basically conquered the entire known world. They've found evidence of Roman trading posts as far away as Bali in Indonesia. There was a shipwreck over there that had Roman trading coins that were dated way, way, way back. That's not to say that the Romans actually were in Indonesia at that time, but they obviously had a great sphere of influence to the point where people were using their coins on the complete opposite side of the planet 2,000 years ago. And as we said at its peak, Rome's armies were considered completely unstoppable, and thus the teeth of iron. It would destroy everyone that it faced. But like we said, Daniel said that this 4th beast was different from the other ones, and the reason why is closely connected to those horns on its head. So let's see what it says about those horns now in verse 24 of Daniel 7. As for the 10 horns, 10 kings will rise up out of that kingdom, and still another one will rise up after them, and he will be different from the first ones, and he will humiliate 3 kings. So we kind of have a family tree going here. First of all, we have this 4th beast that's unlike all the other ones, very powerful. Those 10 horns on its head, we're told, represent other kingdoms, 10 kingdoms. And then out of all those horns, there's one more kingdom that's different from all the other ones before it. Now, let's establish something about the number 10 before we move on here. In the Bible, the number 10 consistently refers to the sum or completeness of something. Remember, we're not talking about a literal vision. We're not going to see this coming out of the sea in the future. The number 10 always represents in the Bible the sum or completeness of something. So if we're talking about 10 horns, 10 governments, then that refers to the sum, all the nations, the sum of all the nations that result from the breakup of that beast that all 10 horns grew from. So the question now is, what about, so that's all the nations that grew out from the Roman Empire. That's represented by that 4th beast there. But the different horn that we need to focus on is that one that grew up from those 10 horns, all the nations that grew from the breakup of that Roman Empire. Which one can we say is unique from all the other ones, special and different? We would have to say that it's the British Empire, because if we know our history, maybe we're familiar with that term, that the sun never sets on the British Empire, because the British Empire was all over the earth. Militarily, culturally, financially, you name it. The British Empire at its peak was the strongest nation on the planet. But if you remember in verse 24, it also said that that little horn grew up to humiliate 3 other horns. What's that talking about? Well, if you remember something very small in history class, then you might remember this event in history. I remember hearing this in 9th grade history class and being fascinated by it because we just talked about it in the Daniel book. The British Empire decisively defeated the navies of France, Spain, and the Netherlands. And even in history books, it says that that was the turning point in its history. That's when the British Empire really asserted itself as the dominant world power. So clearly, it's that British Empire that grew to be unique from all the other nations on earth that grew from the Roman Empire. Now, over time, this horn has become identified not just by the British Empire, but by the United States as well. And there's some good reasoning behind that. First of all, they're close allies. They have similar goals. They work together a lot, very close in conjunction with one another. But we're also aware that they share origins with each other. So these facts all combine to help us understand this little horn, this different horn, as the Anglo-American world power, a combination of those 2 most powerful nations on earth. Now, let's go back to that vision and find out what happens next. Because remember, we're trying to answer that question, when is Jesus going to begin ruling as king? These are all steps in that process. So now let's look at verses 9 and 10. Daniel 7, 9 and 10. I kept watching until thrones were set in place, and the Ancient of Days sat down. His clothing was white like snow, and the hair of his head was like clean wool. His throne was flames of fire. Its wheels were a burning fire. A stream of fire was flowing and going out from before him. 1,000 thousands kept ministering to him, and 10,000 times 10,000 stood before him. The court took its seat, and books were opened. Now we have a couple terms to define there. First of all, we saw the Ancient of Days. Who is that? Well, it becomes pretty obvious that that's another title for Jehovah God himself. And it's simply logical. First of all, Jehovah created everything, including the idea of creation. He created time, and he created his son Jesus Christ. So really, who is left that could possibly fit the bill of being the Ancient of Days? There is no one more ancient than Jehovah. That must be him. But you also recall there that towards the end of verse 10, we saw that there was a court. Let's find out what happens in that court in verses 13 and 14. I kept watching in the visions of the night, and look, with the clouds of the heavens, someone like a son of man was coming. And he gained access to the Ancient of Days. And they brought him up close before that one. And to him, that is the Son of Man, there were given rulership, honor, and a kingdom, that the peoples, nations, and language groups should all serve him. His rulership is an everlasting rulership that will not pass away, and his kingdom will not be destroyed. Clearly, we need to identify the Son of Man now. Well, from what we've already read, we could determine that this is Jesus Christ himself. And if you said that, we would say that you're correct. But remember, the whole point of this is to be able to back up our beliefs, especially from the Bible. So let's look at what Jesus said in Matthew 26. Matthew 26, verses 63 and 64. And to give you a little bit of background, this is when Jesus was arrested, and he's now before the Sanhedrin being questioned. Matthew 26, 63 and 64. But Jesus kept silent. So the high priest said to him, I put you under oath by the living God to tell us whether you are the Christ, the Son of God. Jesus said to him, You yourself said it. But I say to you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So there we see Jesus refer to himself as the Son of Man, and it's not the only place in the Bible where he does that. Not only that, but he describes himself as coming on the clouds of heaven, something else that we saw in Daniel, and we also see that very same phrase being used about Jesus in Revelation chapter 1 and verse 7. Now we have all the pieces to answer our question. Now we can start answering when Jesus is going to begin ruling as king. We read that Jesus was granted the kingship during that court scene that Daniel saw. And we also saw that that court scene was only held after the emergence of that little horn that we saw in Daniel's prophecy, which was the Anglo-American world power. So, comparing this with other prophecies in Daniel, which, as we mentioned, we don't stand a chance of fully covering in a few minutes today, led us to show that 1914 is the year that Jesus became king of God's kingdom. And it also happens to be when the United States and Great Britain during World War I really combined to be a united front to face the threat that they were facing in Europe, in Germany. So, since the evidence in the Bible points to 1914 as the start date of Jesus' rulership as king, now we can start asking some other questions about the makeup of the kingdom. For example, are humans involved? Or is it just Jesus ruling over the same angels that he was around before he was on earth? Well, the Bible clearly tells us that humans do have a part to play in the kingdom.